The evening sky had turned deep purple as Anthony Wright drove home from his law office in downtown Atlanta. His navy blue sedan moved smoothly along the highway as soft jazz played through the speakers. After 14 hours of preparing for an upcoming civil rights case, all he wanted was a hot meal and his comfortable bed. The red and blue lights flashing in his rearview mirror made his heart sink. Anthony checked his speedometer. He was going exactly at the speed limit. He hadn't changed lanes improperly. He hadn't run any lights. With a deep sigh, he pulled over to the shoulder and placed both hands on the steering wheel where they could be seen clearly. Officer Richard Walton approached with his hand resting on his holster, flashlight beam aimed directly at Anthony's face. "License and registration," he barked without introducing himself or explaining the reason for the stop. "Good evening, officer," Anthony said calmly. "May I ask why I'm being pulled over?" The officer's face hardened. "I said license and registration, now." Anthony nodded. "I'll reach for my wallet slowly." He narrated his movements, just as his father had taught him years ago. As he handed over his documents, he noticed Officer Walton's expression change slightly when he saw the Bar Association card in his wallet. "You were speeding and made an illegal lane change back there," Officer Walton said, his tone becoming even more aggressive. Anthony knew this wasn't true. "Sir, I was driving at the speed limit and using my turn signals for all lane changes. Which specific traffic law are you saying I'd violated?" The officer's eyes narrowed. "You think you know the law better than me?" "I'm just trying to understand the situation," Anthony replied. The conversation was going downhill fast, and he made a decision. "Officer, I'm going to record this interaction for both our protection, if that's okay." He reached slowly for his phone on the dashboard mount. "Get out of the car, now." Officer Walton shouted, suddenly yanking the door open. "Officer, please." "I said out." The officer grabbed Anthony's arm, pulling him roughly from the vehicle. Anthony didn't resist but continued speaking clearly. "I'm cooperating, sir. There's no need for." Before he could finish, he found himself pushed against the side of his own car, cold metal handcuffs clicking around his wrists. "Anthony Wright, you're under arrest for obstruction of justice and resisting arrest." "Resisting?" "I didn't resist anything," Anthony said, stunned by the escalation. "Tell it to the judge." Officer Walton sneered, tightening the handcuffs until they dug painfully into Anthony's wrists. As he was placed in the back of the patrol car, Anthony noticed a young woman at the gas station across the street, phone held up, recording the entire incident. Their eyes met briefly, and he gave a small nod. At the police station, Anthony was processed like any other criminal, fingerprinted, photographed, and placed in a holding cell with 2 other men. The irony wasn't lost on him. Just hours earlier, he'd been in his corner office with the framed Harvard Law diploma on the wall, preparing arguments for a major civil rights lawsuit. Now he sat on a cold bench in a cell, his suit wrinkled, waiting to be arraigned on completely fabricated charges. What Officer Walton couldn't have known was that Anthony wasn't just any attorney. He had spent the last 7 years building cases against police departments for civil rights violations. He had argued before federal appeals courts. He knew every relevant precedent and procedure by heart. As he sat in that cell, Anthony didn't feel despair. He felt a familiar clarity, the same focus that had carried him through difficult cases. In his mind, he was already drafting motions, planning discovery requests, and mapping out cross-examination questions. The night grew late as Anthony waited for processing. Other detainees asked why such a well-dressed man was in holding. He explained the situation calmly, even offering legal advice to a young man worried about missing a court date. By morning, when Anthony was finally allowed his phone call, he didn't contact a criminal defense attorney. He didn't call family for bail money. Instead, he called his paralegal. "Tracy, it's Anthony. I need you to pull every precedent on police dashboard camera footage requirements and find out everything you can about an Officer Richard Walton." He smiled slightly as he added, "It looks like I'm going to be representing myself in an unexpected case." What started as a routine drive home was about to become the most important case of Anthony's career, and Officer Walton had no idea what was coming. Morning light filtered through the small window of the holding cell as Anthony was finally processed out on bail. His normally crisp suit was wrinkled, and dark circles hung under his eyes from a sleepless night on the hard bench. As he collected his personal belongings at the front desk, he overheard two officers talking about Walton. "That's the third arrest this week," one said. "Man's on a roll." "Yeah, and they're all the same story," the other replied before noticing Anthony and quickly changing the subject. Outside the station, Tracy waited in Anthony's car. Her face showed both relief and anger when she saw him. "This is absolutely ridiculous," she said as he got in. "I've already pulled what you asked for. Officer Richard Walton has been with the department for 12 years, and guess what I found?" Anthony buckled his seatbelt. "Tell me." 17 complaints for aggressive behavior and racial profiling in the last 5 years alone. 3 internal affairs investigations, all mysteriously closed with no action taken. Tracy handed him a folder. "The community has been keeping track, even if the department hasn't. I contacted that community watchdog group you worked with last year. They've documented Walton's traffic stops for months. Nearly 80% of the people he pulls over are black in a city that's only 30% black." Anthony flipped through the papers, his legal mind already connecting dots. Any of those complaints make it to court. Most people just paid the fines. They couldn't afford to fight, or they were scared of making things worse. A few tried, but without good legal help. Tracy's voice trailed off. Anthony nodded, understanding the pattern. It was one he'd seen too many times in his career. Officers like Walton counting on people's inability to fight back properly. At home, Anthony showered and changed, but didn't rest. He sat at his dining table, spreading out papers as he built his case. His phone rang continuously, colleagues offering help, friends expressing outrage. A local reporter had already caught wind of the story. "Mr. Wright, I heard about your arrest. Given your reputation in civil rights law, people are talking. Would you like to comment?" the reporter asked. "Not at this time," Anthony replied. "But keep your calendar open in the coming weeks. This story is just beginning." By afternoon, Anthony had drafted motions for all available evidence: patrol car footage, body camera video, radio communications, and Walton's complete service record. He knew the department would fight to protect one of their own, but he also knew exactly how to counter each move they might make. His doorbell rang around 6. It was Mrs. Chen from across the street, holding a container of homemade soup. "I heard what happened," she said. "My nephew works at the courthouse. This isn't right." Anthony thanked her for the soup. It happens more often than people realize. "Not to attorneys who know how to fight back," she replied with a knowing smile. "My nephew says Officer Walton has a reputation. Last month, he arrested a young man from our church for suspicious behavior. The boy was just waiting for his mother outside the grocery store." "Would that young man be willing to talk to me?" Anthony asked. Before long, Anthony's living room had become an impromptu meeting space. The young man Mrs. Chen mentioned, a college student named David, shared his experience. Then came a nurse who'd been pulled over twice by Walton, then a retired teacher, then a delivery driver. Each story followed the same pattern: minor traffic stops or questioning that escalated quickly, especially if the person questioned Walton's authority or tried to record the interaction. "He plants evidence too," the delivery driver said quietly. "Put a bag of something in my car, then found it during his search. Judge threw it out because his search was illegal, but most folks don't know enough to fight that." Anthony recorded every testimony, building not just his defense but a larger case. He placed calls to former colleagues at the Justice Department. This wasn't just about clearing his name anymore, it was about stopping a pattern of abuse that had gone unchecked for years. That night, exhausted but determined, Anthony sat at his computer drafting court documents until the screen blurred before his eyes. His arrest wasn't random bad luck. It was one thread in a larger tapestry of injustice, and he was uniquely positioned to unravel it all. As he finally lay down to sleep, his phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. "Careful with Walton. He has friends in high places. Some of us inside the department want him gone too. Check his reports from May 17th last year. Stories don't match the calls that came in." Anthony smiled in the darkness. The wall of silence was already beginning to crack. Anthony's law office buzzed with unusual energy in the weeks following his arrest. Instead of preparing for corporate cases, his team had redirected their efforts to his defense. Large whiteboards covered with timelines, legal precedents, and strategy notes lined the walls. Boxes of files sat stacked in corners, all related to Officer Walton's previous arrests. The prosecutor offered a deal, Tracy announced, walking into Anthony's office with a coffee in each hand. She placed one on his desk. Plead guilty to disorderly conduct, pay a small fine, and they'll drop the resisting arrest charge. Anthony looked up from the deposition he was reviewing. They're already backing down. Want me to tell them where to stick their offer? Tracy asked with a half smile. No. Tell them, Anthony paused, thinking carefully. Tell them their offer demonstrates consciousness of a weak case, but we need more time to consider all options. Tracy nodded, playing it cool. I like it. We don't want them to know how much we already have. Anthony explained, gesturing to the stack of witness statements on his desk. Every day more people are coming forward. The phone rang, and Tracy stepped out to answer it. Anthony turned back to his computer, where he was reviewing footage he'd finally obtained from a security camera at the gas station across from where he'd been pulled over. The silent video clearly showed his car driving normally, using turn signals properly, and being pulled over for no apparent reason. It also showed how calmly he had exited the car when ordered, with no resistance whatsoever. Tracy popped her head back in. That was Mike from Digital Forensics. He found something interesting in the police radio logs. The timestamps don't match up with Walton's report. But how much? Walton reported calling in your stop at 9:42 p.m., but the actual radio call was at 9:53 p.m., 11 minutes after he already had you in handcuffs. Anthony jotted this down. He wrote the report before even calling it in. Classic sign of fabrication. A knock at the door interrupted them. It was Detective Luis Rodriguez, an old friend from Anthony's days working with the district attorney's office. This is unofficial, Luis said quietly after Tracy closed the door. But word is getting around about your case, and some of us aren't comfortable with what happened. Anthony gestured for him to sit. I'm listening. Walton's been untouchable because he's Captain Phillips' brother-in-law. Internal Affairs gets pressured to drop investigations. But this time he messed with the wrong person. Luis slid a flash drive across the desk. This is footage from Walton's body camera the night he arrested you. Anthony's eyebrows shot up. The department told us it malfunctioned. That's what Walton claimed. But 8 backs up everything automatically. He manually deleted his footage, but didn't realize the system keeps backups for 30 days. Anthony picked up the drive, feeling its weight in his palm. This is huge, Luis. You could get in trouble. Some things are more important than keeping your head down, Luis replied. There's more. Check his arrest records from February to April last year. Notice anything? Anthony pulled up the file on his computer. As he scrolled through the data, a pattern emerged. His arrest numbers tripled. Right after the department started that unofficial quota system, the one they publicly deny exists. Officers who hit certain numbers got preferred shifts and overtime opportunities. So he started manufacturing arrests to boost his stats, Anthony said, the pieces fitting together. Luis stood to leave. Like I said, this conversation never happened. But if someone were to subpoena those specific records and ask the right questions under oath. After Luis left, Anthony and Tracy watched the body camera footage. It showed exactly what Anthony had claimed, a calm interaction that Walton escalated artificially. Most stunning of all, it captured Walton turning to his patrol car and muttering to himself, another one for the books. These people need to learn respect. That evening, Anthony worked late into the night, preparing not just for his defense, but for what would become something much bigger. His small team ordered takeout and continued refining their strategy. You know what bothers me most? Anthony said as they reviewed witness statements. How many people without legal training would stand a chance against this? How many innocent people are sitting in jail because they couldn't fight back properly? He looked at the growing mountain of evidence, feeling both anger and determination. His unfair arrest had opened a door that couldn't be closed again. Tomorrow, he would file not just motions for his defense, but the groundwork for a class action lawsuit that would shake the entire department. They picked the wrong person to mess with, Tracy said, echoing what many had already observed. Anthony nodded. And now they're about to find out exactly what that means. The county courthouse buzzed with unusual energy that Monday morning. Word had spread about the case, drawing curious courthouse staffers, law students, and even a few reporters. Anthony arrived early, dressed in his best charcoal suit, a crisp white shirt, and a deep blue tie that his grandfather had given him when he passed the bar exam. "Quite a crowd," Tracy whispered as they walked through the security checkpoint. She carried a leather briefcase stuffed with carefully organized evidence. "People love an underdog story," Anthony replied with a slight smile, nodding to a court officer he recognized from previous cases. Inside the courtroom, Assistant District Attorney Robert Fleming was already at the prosecution table, looking through papers with two junior prosecutors. When he spotted Anthony, his expression flickered with unease. "Mr. Wright," Fleming said, approaching with an outstretched hand. "I was expecting to meet your attorney today." Anthony shook his hand firmly. "I'll be representing myself, Mr. Fleming." Fleming's smile tightened. "Bold choice. My office still stands if you'd like to resolve this quickly." "I appreciate that," Anthony replied calmly. "But I believe the evidence speaks for itself." As they took their places, Officer Walton strode in through a side door, his uniform pressed and his badge gleaming. He nodded confidently to the prosecution team before noticing Anthony. For just a second, surprise crossed his face, perhaps expecting a frightened defendant with an overworked public defender, not the composed attorney setting up his own defense. The bailiff called for all to rise as Judge Eleanor Wilson entered. Known for her no-nonsense approach and fairness, she surveyed the unusually full courtroom with raised eyebrows. "Seems we have quite an audience today," she remarked, settling into her chair. "Let's proceed with the People versus Anthony Wright." Fleming presented the charges with practiced confidence: obstruction of justice and resisting arrest. He described Anthony as combative and uncooperative during a routine traffic stop. When it was his turn to speak, Anthony stood slowly. "Your Honor, I'll be representing myself in these proceedings." Judge Wilson peered over her reading glasses. "Mr. Wright, while you have that right, I must advise you of the risks." "I understand, Your Honor. I've been practicing law for 11 years, primarily in civil rights cases." A murmur passed through the courtroom. The judge nodded, suddenly more attentive. "Very well. Proceed." "I move to dismiss all charges based on lack of probable cause for the initial stop and evidence of falsified police reports," Anthony stated clearly. Fleming jumped to his feet. "Your Honor, this is completely inappropriate for an arraignment." "Perhaps," Judge Wilson replied, "but I'm curious about these allegations. Mr. Wright, do you have evidence to support these claims?" "Yes, Your Honor," Anthony said, pulling out a folder. "I have security camera footage showing no traffic violations occurred, timestamps proving Officer Walton's report was written before he called in the stop, and statements from 16 other citizens who experienced similar treatment from this officer." The courtroom fell silent. Judge Wilson's expression hardened as she looked from the evidence to Officer Walton, who had suddenly gone pale. "Your Honor," Fleming interjected, "this is the first time we're seeing this material. The prosecution requests time to review." "Granted," the judge said. "We'll recess for 1 hour. Mr. Fleming, I suggest you review this carefully." As the judge left the bench, the courtroom erupted in whispers. Officer Walton hurried to speak with the prosecution team, his earlier confidence evaporating. Anthony remained at his table, calmly organizing his notes. An elderly black man in the gallery caught his eye and gave him a subtle nod of approval. During the recess, Anthony watched Fleming and his team reviewing the evidence in a side room. Their body language told the story: lots of head shaking, tense gestures, and concerned glances toward Officer Walton. Tracy returned from making calls with a cup of coffee for Anthony. The community activist group is outside with supporters. Local news is picking up the story, and 3 more people called the office with similar experiences with Walton. "Perfect," Anthony said, taking a sip. "But we're just getting started." When court resumed, Fleming looked considerably less confident. Judge Wilson returned, her expression grave. "Before we continue," she said, "I understand the prosecution may wish to address the court." Fleming stood slowly. "Your Honor, in light of new evidence, the state moves to dismiss all charges against Mr. Wright." A cheer erupted from the back of the courtroom before the judge banged her gavel for order. Officer Walton stared in disbelief. "Motion granted," Judge Wilson said. Then, fixing Officer Walton with a stern gaze, she added, "And I am referring this matter to the District Attorney's Office for investigation into possible perjury and falsification of evidence." Anthony gathered his materials, nodding respectfully to the judge. This wasn't just a victory, it was the beginning. The real battle for justice was just about to start. 2 weeks after the charges were dismissed, Anthony sat in a conference room at the county prosecutor's office. The investigation into Officer Walton had moved with surprising speed, largely due to the evidence Anthony had provided and the media attention the case had attracted. District Attorney Patricia Howard entered, followed by a man Anthony recognized as the police chief, Thomas Grayson. Both looked solemn. "Mr. Wright," DA Howard began, "first, let me apologize for what you experienced. It should never have happened." Anthony nodded but remained silent. Apologies weren't why he was here. "We've reviewed your evidence and conducted our own investigation," she continued. "Officer Walton has been placed on administrative leave pending formal charges for falsifying police reports and perjury." "That's a start," Anthony said, "but we both know he's not the only problem." Chief Grayson shifted uncomfortably. "What exactly are you suggesting?" Anthony opened his laptop and turned it toward them. "This is a statistical analysis of traffic stops and arrests in your department over the last 5 years, broken down by officer and demographic data." He clicked through several charts and graphs. "The pattern goes beyond Walton. Your department has a systemic issue with racial profiling and discriminatory enforcement." "These numbers don't prove intent," Chief Grayson argued. "Perhaps not alone," Anthony agreed, "but combined with sworn statements from 37 citizens who've experienced similar treatment and evidence of a quota system that incentivizes officers to make unnecessary arrests." He let the implication hang in the air. DA Howard leaned forward. "What are you proposing, Mr. Wright?" "I'm filing a class action lawsuit tomorrow on behalf of everyone wrongfully targeted by your department's discriminatory practices. However," Anthony paused, "I'm prepared to work with you on a consent decree instead, if you are serious about real reform." The meeting lasted 3 hours. By the end, both the DA and the police chief understood they were facing either a lengthy, expensive, and public legal battle they would likely lose, or the opportunity to be seen as champions of necessary change. The following day, Anthony arrived at the courthouse for what would become Officer Walton's first hearing on charges of perjury and falsification of evidence. A small crowd of supporters and media had gathered outside. Anthony noticed the young man who had recorded his arrest from the gas station, now wearing a t-shirt that read "Justice for All." Inside, the courtroom hushed as Officer Walton was led in, no longer in uniform, but in a plain navy suit that seemed too big for him. The confidence he'd shown at Anthony's hearing was gone, replaced by a tense, rigid posture. Judge Wilson presided again. "Officer Richard Walton, you are charged with 3 counts of perjury and 2 counts of falsifying police reports. How do you plead?" Walton's attorney, a stern-looking woman from the police union, spoke up. "Not guilty, Your Honor." Anthony sat in the gallery, watching carefully. He wasn't officially part of this proceeding, but his evidence had made it possible. More importantly, he knew what came next would set the stage for the larger case against the department. As the hearing continued, Anthony felt someone sit beside him. It was Detective Rodriguez. "Bold move," Rodriguez whispered. "The whole department's talking about your class action." "Are they angry?" Anthony asked. "Some are. Others," Rodriguez hesitated. "Others are relieved. There are good cops who've been trying to speak up about these issues for years." The judge set Walton's bail at $50,000 and scheduled the next hearing. As Walton was led out, his eyes locked with Anthony's for a brief moment. There was no anger there, just a hollow realization. Outside the courthouse, reporters surrounded Anthony. "Mr. Wright, what can you tell us about the class action lawsuit? Is it true you're demanding the police chief's resignation? Will you be seeking monetary damages?" Anthony raised his hands for quiet. "This isn't about money or any individual's job. This is about fixing a broken system. What happened to me happens to people in our community every day, people without law degrees, people who can't fight back. He paused, making eye contact with several faces in the crowd. This lawsuit isn't just my case. It belongs to everyone who's been pulled over for driving while black, everyone who's been searched without cause, everyone who's been treated as guilty until proven innocent. A woman in the crowd called out, "Thank you for fighting for us." Anthony nodded acknowledgement. The fight is just beginning. But for the first time in a long time, we have reason to believe we can win. As he walked down the courthouse steps, his phone rang. It was the police chief's office. The consent decree negotiations were starting tomorrow. Real change was finally within reach. The community center buzzed with voices as people filed in, filling every seat and lining the walls. Anthony stood at the front beside Tracy and a team of volunteer lawyers, watching as faces both familiar and new joined the gathering. They had expected maybe 50 people for this town hall meeting. Over 200 had shown up. "I think we need more chairs," Tracy whispered, surveying the crowd. Anthony nodded, amazed by the turnout. 3 months had passed since his case was dismissed, and what began as one man's fight had grown into a movement. The class action lawsuit now included over 100 plaintiffs, each with their own story of mistreatment at the hands of the police department. "Good evening, everyone," Anthony began once the room settled. "Thank you for coming. I know many of you took time off work or arranged childcare to be here." An older woman in the front row called out, "We wouldn't miss it. You're fighting for all of us." Appreciative murmurs rippled through the crowd. "I have some updates to share," Anthony continued. "First, the consent decree negotiations with the department have reached a critical stage. Chief Grayson has agreed to implement body cameras for all officers with strict penalties for turning them off during interactions with the public." Applause broke out. Second, the department will establish an independent civilian review board with real power to investigate complaints and recommend disciplinary action. More applause, louder this time. Third, they've agreed to mandatory bias training for all officers and a complete overhaul of their traffic stop protocols. A man stood up in the back. "What about Officer Walton? He ruined my son's life with false charges." Anthony nodded sullenly. "Officer Walton's trial for perjury begins next week. Based on the evidence, I expect a conviction. More importantly, the investigation has expanded to include 4 other officers with similar patterns of misconduct." Detective Rodriguez, now openly allied with Anthony's cause, stepped forward. "I can confirm that Internal Affairs is reviewing every arrest made by these officers over the past 3 years. Cases with evidence of misconduct will be referred for possible dismissal." The room grew quiet as a young woman raised her hand. Her voice shook slightly as she spoke. "My brother is serving 5 years because of a false arrest by Walton. Will this help him?" Anthony met her eyes. "Yes. If your brother's case shows evidence of misconduct, he could be eligible for immediate release and compensation. Please see me or one of our volunteer attorneys after the meeting." As the meeting continued, Anthony presented data that his team had meticulously gathered, maps showing how certain neighborhoods were targeted, charts displaying racial disparities in arrests and charges, and testimony from former officers who confirmed the unofficial quota system. "What makes this case powerful," Anthony explained, "isn't just the evidence of individual misconduct. It's the pattern, the system that encourages and rewards that misconduct." A reporter from the local newspaper stood up. "Mr. Wright, sources tell us the department has offered a settlement of $12 million to end the lawsuit. Will you accept it?" The room tensed, waiting for his answer. "Money isn't justice," Anthony replied firmly. "Yes, there's a financial offer on the table. But our negotiations are focused on changing policies and practices, not just paying damages. We won't settle unless the agreement includes real, measurable reforms that protect this community going forward." The crowd erupted in approval. After the meeting, Anthony stayed late, speaking individually with community members. An elderly man grasped his hand tightly. "My grandson was stopped 3 times in 1 month," he said. "Each time, they searched his car, found nothing, and let him go with a warning. No ticket, no charge, just harassment because he's a young black man driving a nice car." "That stops now," Anthony promised. Later that night, as Anthony drove home, he passed the spot where Walton had pulled him over. He slowed down, remembering the anger and helplessness he'd felt that night. The case had consumed his life for months now. His regular legal practice had suffered, and he'd invested thousands of his own dollars into the fight. Yet, looking at what they'd accomplished, a community united, a powerful lawsuit moving forward, real reforms taking shape, he knew it was worth every sacrifice. His unjust arrest had opened the door to challenge decades of discriminatory policing. His phone rang. It was the mayor's office calling. The city council wanted to discuss fast-tracking the reforms rather than waiting for a court order. The tides are turning, Anthony thought as he answered the call. Finally, they're listening. 1 year later, Anthony stood at the podium in City Hall's main chamber, addressing a packed room. Sunlight streamed through tall windows, illuminating faces that had become familiar during the long fight for justice. City council members, community leaders, police officials, and dozens of ordinary citizens had gathered for what many were calling a historic day. Today marks not an ending, but a beginning, Anthony said, his voice steady and clear. The consent decree we're signing isn't just a piece of paper. It's a promise to our community that law enforcement will protect and serve everyone equally, regardless of race, income, or neighborhood. Behind him sat Police Chief Grayson, looking both solemn and relieved. Next to him was the new head of the Civilian Oversight Committee, Mrs. Washington, a retired teacher who had experienced police harassment firsthand. The mayor, initially resistant to reform, now smiled for the cameras, eager to be associated with positive change. One traffic stop 1 year ago could have been just another injustice, Anthony continued. Instead, it became the catalyst for transformation. Not because I'm special, but because we as a community decided enough was enough. He outlined the key provisions of the agreement: comprehensive data collection on all police interactions, body cameras with strict compliance requirements, a complete overhaul of training, elimination of quotas, and a powerful civilian review board with real authority. Most importantly, Anthony emphasized, this agreement includes a process to review past cases. Already, 17 people have been released from jail after their convictions were found to be based on false reports or illegal searches. In the front row sat a young man named Thomas, recently freed after serving 2 years on charges brought by Officer Walton. Next to him was his mother, wiping away tears of joy and relief. Anthony stepped back as the mayor approached the podium to sign the official documents. The room erupted in applause as each signature was added: the mayor, the police chief, Anthony representing the plaintiffs, and Mrs. Washington for the Community Oversight Committee. Afterward, as people mingled and congratulated each other, Detective Rodriguez approached Anthony. "Quite a difference from that night in the holding cell," he said with a smile. "Officer Walton got 8 years, by the way." The judge wasn't impressed by his defense. Anthony nodded. "And the others?" "2 took plea deals in exchange for testimony about the department's practices. One's fighting the charges, but with the evidence we have, he doesn't stand a chance." Tracy joined them, champagne glass in hand. "We should celebrate, boss. The foundation just got approved for nonprofit status. Full funding for 3 years. The Anthony Wright Justice Foundation had been Anthony's latest project, a legal aid organization dedicated to helping victims of police misconduct and working with departments on implementing reforms. Already, representatives from 3 neighboring cities had reached out, hoping to adopt similar changes without going through lengthy lawsuits. As the celebration continued, Anthony slipped outside for a moment of quiet. The courthouse steps where he had once faced reporters alone were now filled with community members taking photos and celebrating. A group of law students who had volunteered on the case chatted excitedly about their future careers. An older gentleman approached, leaning heavily on a cane. "Mr. Wright? My grandson was one of the people you helped get released. I just wanted to shake your hand." Anthony smiled and took the man's weathered hand in both of his. "How is he doing?" "Got a job already, going back to community college in the fall." The old man's eyes glistened. "He told me what you said to him when he got out. About how what happened to him wasn't right, but what he did with his life now would define him, not what was done to him." Anthony remembered that conversation. "He's going to be fine. Because of you." Anthony shook his head. "Because of all of us working together. One person can start something, but it takes a community to create real change." As the sun began to set, casting golden light across the city, Anthony looked at the gathering of people who had become an unexpected family through this struggle. His law practice had changed completely, fewer corporate clients, more civil rights cases. His life was busier, more challenging, but infinitely more fulfilling. What had begun with one unjust traffic stop had transformed not just a police department, but an entire community's relationship with justice. As Anthony rejoined the celebration, he carried with him the knowledge that sometimes the worst injustices lead to the greatest opportunities for change.